I wrote this book because there were a significant number of young adults who were turning away from the Christian faith. The numbers are staggering. And often they were turning away from the Christian faith not because of the message of the gospel, but because of the way Christians act, the way Christians present Christ, the way they talk about the gospel, that was found to be off-putting by them. My hope is for Christians who are reading this book that it is an exercise in sensitization, that the book is helping them understand some of the ways in which we talk about our faith or live our faith that might be off-putting that we would never know about. The truth is, all of us are unchristian at times. All of us act more like the Pharisees than we act like Jesus sometimes. I do. I consider myself a recovering Pharisee. And there are many examples of that. You know, when we say, well, love the sinner but hate the sin. Well, that sounds very pious to us. Well, we're going to be all about love. We're going to love the sinner and hate the sin. When you're the person that someone else is calling the sinner, and you're going to love me, but you're going to hate something that I consider an inherent part of who I am, or you're going to hate the way I love my partner or my closest companion, I don't hear that the same way that you're saying it. It also is going to maybe help us think of different ways we might think of these issues. So the goal isn't, well, let's do a poll and find out what young adults think and then we'll all believe that. The goal is to really wonder, is there anything that young adults are saying that might lead us to actually find a truer portrayal of the Christian faith or an understanding of the faith than we might have had otherwise. And so my hope is it'll stretch us. It will, as Christians, it will challenge us to be more authentically Christian, to live out the teachings of Jesus more fully, and even to think theologically about issues like the providence of God, or how God looks at other religions, or even how God looks at homosexuals. The first that we talk about in the book is hypocrisy, or judgmentalism, or a sort of black and white, very narrow, and almost a mean-spirited approach to the faith. So we find Christians who, in their words, they're so dogmatic and that it is off-putting for young adults. But it's not just their dogmatism. It's a spirit that seems to, it's a judgmental spirit. It's a spirit that seems to be sometimes even cruel with the words that we use. So instead of loving people, we speak to them in ways that hurt them. We make them feel small. And so there's that, and there's the inconsistency between that making people feel small and the Jesus who calls us to love. The second has to do with science and faith. And again, this sort of ties into a kind of narrow-mindedness or an anti-intellectualism, but young adults have been raised with science classes in which they learned that the Earth is 4 billion years old, the universe is 14 to 15 billion years old. And then they hear from some Christians that in order to be a Christian, you have to accept the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis as science. And then you have to take the genealogies that you found in the book of Genesis, you add them together, and you determine that the earth is only 6,000 years old. And so when young adults have to make a decision between what they learned in science class, which makes a great deal of sense to them, and a very literalistic reading of the first few chapters of the book of Genesis, if they have to decide that to be a Christian is to accept that literalistically, they say, you know what, give me science, because I don't think that was written as a scientific textbook. And so often we've created this false dichotomy between science and faith, and you have to give up science in order to accept a, quote, biblical worldview, or you have to give up Christianity in order to appreciate science. And so I think Christians get it wrong when they do that. The third idea in the book has to do with how Christians talk about people of other faiths. And there was a day in which, when I was a child, I knew one person who was Jewish. I didn't know anyone who was Hindu, Muslim. I had no contact with people of other faiths. But in the world today, in America today, most young people have friends who are Muslim or Hindu, or have friends who are exploring the Buddhist faith, or maybe they're Jewish. And when Christians speak with absolute certainty and clarity about the fact that everyone is going to hell, God will send everyone to eternal torment if they haven't personally received Jesus as their Lord and Savior, young adults say, how can that be a God of justice? I know my friend prays 5 times a day. I know they love God. I know they serve the poor. They seem to love God with all their heart and love their neighbors. They love themselves. And yet God will eternally torment them because they didn't know to accept Jesus. And so for them, there's a real conflict between the idea of a God of justice and love and the idea that God will eternally torment their friends who actually love God and are seeking to follow God. The next topic that young adults have struggled with is one that people of every age have struggled with, all the way back to biblical times, and that's the issue of suffering. And how do we reconcile God and suffering? And so what often young adults hear Christians say is things like, well, whatever suffering had happened, it must have happened for a reason. It was God's will that this happened. And when young adults take seriously the suffering they see in their world, and then they hear Christians say, whatever happened must have been God's will, they find a huge disconnect. You want me to follow a God of love who died on a cross out of sacrificial love for me, and yet you want me to believe that God causes the rape and murder of my friend, or God causes the death of children, or God caused the death of 200,000 people in Haiti as an act of judgment, or for some mysterious reason we don't understand. So when young adults hear Christians talk about suffering as though God caused the suffering, they raise the same question we all raise. Is that really how God is? Is that what God does? And so an entire chapter is devoted to really wrestling with the problem of suffering or the problem of evil. Christians call that theodicy, or we talk about it in terms of the providence of God and God's interaction in the world. And so I try to help non-religious young people to hear a different answer to that than what they've often heard. I had one young woman who emailed me and said that her baby had died. And after her baby's death, her Christian friends came to her and said, well, it must have been the will of God. And she said, I decided then that if God is a God who takes babies from their mommies, I'm not interested in following him. And so there's a whole chapter devoted to that. And then finally we get to the issue of homosexuality. And for my generation, when I was a young person, I knew of a handful of people who I thought might be gay. Never would they have acknowledged that openly. Today, 5 to 10% of the United States population would say, I'm homosexual. From the time I was little, I was different. And parents who recognize from the time this child was little, they were different. And almost every person, one Sunday I asked our congregation, I said, how many of you know somebody you care about, a friend, a coworker, a family member who is gay? Almost everybody in the congregation raised their hand. That wouldn't have been said 40 years ago. Unfortunately, what Christianity has become known for in the last 10 years is being anti-gay. That's what Kinnaman found in his work with the Barna Group, is that 91% of all young adults said that the thing that they think of when they think of Christians is anti-homosexual. And I think that has to grieve the heart of God. However you come out on this issue, and I think it's important that the church wrestle with this and Christians wrestle with this issue and really think about it carefully. But wherever you come out, to think that 91% of all young adults who are outside the church, that's the 40% of young adults who aren't involved and have said, I'm not Christian, that if that's the first thing they think of when it comes to Christianity, we have to be grieved by that. And so in the chapter in the book on homosexuality, we talk about those perceptions young adults have of Christians. We talk about some of the common ways in which Christians speak about homosexual people, in which I think we really get it wrong. And then I try to help us think about, in the light of the Scriptures, is there a different way that we might look and think theologically and biblically about the issue of homosexuality? I don't care whether people agree with the argument that I make in the text. In the end, what I ask is, what does it look like to get it right when it comes to homosexuality, even if you're a more conservative Christian? And I think what that looks like is less judgment and more love. And when we demonstrate that, even homosexual people say, I understand you may not agree with the decisions I've made, but I so appreciate the fact that you love me anyway. The last chapter then comes back and asks the question, what does it look like when Christians get it right? And the focus of that last chapter is to look at the primary message of Jesus. He called us to love God, and he called us to love our neighbors. And then he demonstrated what that love looked like. He teaches us what it looks like when he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, helping the stranger who is in need. He calls us to feed those who are hungry and clothe those who are naked. He calls us to love our enemies. He calls us to do good to those who would harm us. And so in the last chapter, it really is an invitation, first of all, for non-religious people to see this is the heart of the message of the gospel. It's about love, which young adults find very compelling. But it's also an invitation for Christians reading the book to say, let's live like that. And when we do that, when we are seeking actively to love, that is to serve people who are in need, to help the world look more like the kingdom of God, to offer ourselves in service to others, when we do that, the world will find Christianity compelling. And there will be a future for the Christian faith when it's lived like that.